Hello, my name is Pam Thomas, and I'm the coordinator for the Northern Virginia and DC chapter of CHAD. I want to welcome you to our Understanding ADHD webinar series. Our chapter is a volunteer organization of trained professionals who offer support to our ADHD community by providing these monthly webinars, offer support groups for parents and adults, and feature special lectures and events to honor the ADHD Awareness Month in October.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar panel discussion that we're having for CHAD. We're very excited to be able to present in this format. We think it'll be cleaner and easier for you guys, our audience, to be able to find the information that you want and need. Our topic tonight is parenting strategies for children with ADHD, providing the best supports for our children's success. I'm Kathy Essig. I am one of your moderators this evening, and I'm a member of the CHAD board. I'm joined by Dr. Salim Namazi, also a board member, and my co-moderator. Dr. Namazi is going to introduce our panelists, and we are excited to get going.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited about this two-part series. So first, we have Dr. Christina Tripodi, who is a licensed clinical and school psychologist and board-certified school neuropsychologist. She's the founder and clinical director of the Child and Family Practice of Washington, D.C., where they provide psychological and educational services for all ages. Dr. Tripodi has experience across medical, clinical, and school settings, as well as internationally in the UK. She holds advanced psychology degrees and is an active member of several professional organizations. Dr. Tripodi also serves on the medical staff at Virginia Hospital Center and teaches at George Washington University. We also have Dr. Sarah Robison, who is an executive functioning specialist and educator with 20 years of experience. She's a neurotypical parent of 3, including 1 child with ADHD. So she doesn't just work in the field, she lives in it every day. She brings a unique perspective working and living in the world of supporting children's success.
Welcome, ladies. Thank you for joining us. We're going to begin with Dr. Tripodi giving us a little bit of background on children with ADHD and a parent's role.
So as many of the families who are joining us this evening are members of CHAD and familiar with ADHD, just to give a quick overview, ADHD is generally described as a disorder where children exhibit atypical symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, or impulsivity. And of course, as we know, the manifestation of these symptoms can vary depending on age and gender. And so to answer your question, Kathy, there are so many different ways that the family and parents in particular can play a role in supporting, kids with ADHD. Something I think we're going to talk a lot about tonight, and I want to highlight, is the role of the parent as an advocate, and the importance of having a deep understanding of the specific way that ADHD presents in your child, because we know that ADHD is a spectrum, right, and can present so differently in all of our kiddos. And so, first, having a clear understanding of the way it presents in your kid, the signs to look out for, and then, of course, acting as their advocate across the different systems of their lives, liaising between school and sports and music and all the different facets of, your child's life are going to be so essential for the parent.
Just following up on that for a minute, Christina, and then Sarah, I want to get to you with similar question. But so often a parent might find out that there is something going on at school, and they probably had a sense of something's going on for a while, but they weren't sure what it was. If you have a sense that your child is struggling and you're not sure what's going on, you mentioned, being that advocate. How would you say that parents should, for anybody here who's just starting this process with something's up and I'm not sure what, how would you tell them to move forward? Who would they speak to?
Sure. So, if your child does not yet have a diagnosis of ADHD, but, again, like you said, Kathy, you feel something's up, that, you're trusting your parent instinct, you're starting to hear reports from school, a really great first place to start is with the child's teacher and getting, again, a clear understanding of exactly are they observing at school? How is your child behaving? How are they interacting with their peers? what are the areas of concern that are popping up? Is it happening in one setting? Is it happening at recess? Is it happening during a specific part of the day? We want to get a really good understanding of what you're observing or what the teachers are observing and when. And then a really great thing to do is to meet with the teacher and the school team, which generally involves either the social worker or the counselor or the school psychologist, just to get a sense from a more clinical perspective and the academic perspective of how your kiddo is presenting in school. And I know we'll talk about this a little bit later too, but then there are steps you can take to, ask for some further evaluation and get some further data from the school as well.
So may I actually,
Exactly.
can I interject? So that's such helpful advice. What if the teacher says that they don't notice anything? Because I know like with ADHD with girls, that can be, they can mask. And so do you have other recommendations for in
Yeah.
situations like that?
Definitely. So a lot of times, especially with girls, and a lot of times with our inattentive kiddos across the board, right? Because they're better at masking, right? And it's not as generally disruptive to a class when a kid is inattentive or they're, working really hard to keep it together and mask more of those physical impulses. So it might not always be on a teacher's radar, right? A great thing to do is to talk to an outside professional and ask them about administering some questionnaires and rating scales to you as the parent, to the teacher, and perhaps to somebody like a coach or a family member who observes your kiddo in a different setting as well. We want to look for the symptom presentations across different settings so that this way we can see, if this really is an issue, and the kiddo is masking in school, but we have data from other areas, we can talk to the teacher and the school about, we really do think this is going on, and can we start gathering some more observational data in school about how this might be impacting my kid?
Good advice.
So Sarah,
Mhm.
as a parent, and I know that the birth order is it's your oldest son who is diagnosed. How old was he and how did that process occur? Because I believe parents' gut instinct is often correct. And at what point did you know? And at what point did you have to then pursue the help and support that he would need in other environments?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question because I was just thinking about that the other day because he started kindergarten in 2020 during the pandemic. And so he was at home for a good bit of time before they went back to school. And having, experience in education, I uh, felt like something was there. It was kind of that initial gut instinct where I could see him struggle and things were hard. And I reached out to his classroom teacher as a first step. We had the team meeting, and actually the first determination was that the school was not going to pursue any assessments or testing because they didn't believe that there was a diagnosis present. And so I had to really become an advocate at that point and follow up with the school and pursue some other avenues in order to get to the point where we were able to get testing. But it is kind of interesting because, as a parent, there is that sixth sense that you have about your own child that it can feel really frustrating when the school isn't in alignment with what you're seeing. And it almost feels like you're talking about two different children. So that was kind of the initial path that we had to go down. And it probably would have been different had we been in school and, things were relatively normal. But things have, I think that actually set us up to really be able to advocate much more effectively having that initial experience early on.
Sarah, when you said that you noticed some signs that he was
Mhm.
struggling,
Mhm.
would you be, if you can recall what any
Mhm.
specific signs you noticed? I think that could be helpful for parents to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So there were just some things that he would say, and that was really kind of the first sign for me. So he would say things like, "My brain makes me do things that I don't mean to." And so he's 5 years old,
Oh,
and he's saying that his brain just doesn't feel like it's working correctly. He would also need a lot of support with, things like cleaning or organizing. Um, he would say, "You want me to clean my room, but I don't know how. I don't know how to clean my room." And the way that he would say it, I really believed him. And I feel like a lot of times, as a parent, I was like, "Well, you just clean it. Like you just clean your room." And he just really didn't know what that meant. Um, so there were things like that that really stood out to me. And then there were some other signs that I would see where I would talk with him and I could just kind of see that he wasn't attending to the conversation anymore. He was kind of looking off. He wasn't able to repeat what I was saying. So just little things like that that really started to add up. And then watching him in kindergarten on Zoom was a really interesting experience because I think that would just be hard for anyone, which I think is why the process took a little bit longer. But he just had a really tough time following conversations, being able to engage with others. And so all those things kind of added up, over the course of the year. So that's what led us down the path.
So the soft signs are often there early, but for some students, there is an earlier diagnosis than, maybe that second grade, fourth grade time frame in school. Christina, can you tell me if you're diagnosing young versus older children or teens, what's the difference in like presentation and diagnosis?
Sure. So I'll talk about the more common, concerns that get flagged for us, in private practice anyway. With our little kids, the biggest things that I think we hear as clinicians are the more disruptive features of ADHD, particularly, and I'm going to speak generally here with our boys. And oftentimes these kids are, described as being overly fidgety or restless, or they're interrupting or impulsive or calling out during class, or parents might describe that their kid is driven by a motor, that they just can't sit still, they can't do one thing for more than any given amount of time, but also they can focus for a long time on things that they really really like video games or iPad time or whatever it is. And with our little guys too, from more of the inattentive perspective, we start to hear things like, I was at my kid's soccer game and they're 5 years old and the team's down here and my kid's over here, kind of like, checking things out. And we find ourselves constantly calling, after them to come and join. And with our older kids, some of those hyperactive, impulsive symptoms start to settle a bit as kids become a little more socially aware, and they try to mask, or they try to keep it together a bit more. But the inattentiveness is definitely still there. And we also start to see a real impact with executive functions, like Sarah was alluding to, with disorganization, with a hard time keeping track of assignments. The classic, kiddo who's doing really, really well on tests, but all of the homework is missing. So they're getting a C in the class, but an A on the test and a 0 on the homework. So those are a lot of the things that are flagged for us.
So, Sarah, as your son has gotten older, I'm always intrigued with the students that came out of the pandemic, having been diagnosed during the pandemic. Do you see that? Do you think, as somebody who also works in executive function, that the pandemic added to potentially his delay in executive function because he didn't have that school structure that they build into understanding shifting and some time management, because there are bells. I always said the bells not being there kind of killed the kids.
Mhm. I mean, anecdotally for sure. Like I don't have the data to say, 100%. Yes, that's the case, but especially from my son's perspective, not having that in-person teacher to, even as teachers move through the day, they're demonstrating executive functioning and time management. They're moving through the classroom. The classroom is organized in a certain way. They're referring to different parts of the room. Okay, now it's time for this. Now it's time for this. And I do think for my son in particular, that was a real struggle for him to not have that reinforcement and that informal instruction around some of those pieces. I think he's catching up for sure. I think even students without ADHD diagnoses, it probably impacted them too.
Yeah.
But they're probably able to catch up perhaps a bit faster than our students and our children with ADHD. So that's I especially in the early years and during transition years, I think the pandemic really threw a wrench in the education of some of our littles with ADHD.
Sarah, I mean, it was pretty amazing that you were able to navigate the school system the way you did, and it sounds like you had to really advocate for your child to get, the ADHD recognized and tested for. I mean, do you have advice or tips for parents on how to navigate that and maybe talk more about your journey going through that?
Absolutely. I was so thankful that I had a background in education going through this process because um, I I just don't know that I could have done it otherwise, to be honest, during the time of the pandemic. And it was actually feedback that I gave my son's school that the only reason that we were able to get to this point is because I had my own professional experience in the domain. And how unfair is that to other families who don't have that perspective? And I really, having to advocate for him, I really had and this may come up later too, but I really had this sort of bank of phrases that I would use. And so, I would ask the school, like, I'm really curious about, or I'm wondering about, or at home, I see this, and really having some sentence starters that I use for myself when reaching out about my son. Just to really make it a collaborative process and not make it seem confrontational, or angry in any way. And certainly I was wanting our perspective to be heard, but I really wanted to do so in a way that would be productive and effective for everyone. And so that was like using that language and having those, like, literally I had a post-it note on my computer that had like this list of these sentence starters that I could always use when I wanted to say, like, well, this is what I'm seeing. Why don't you see this?
Right.
Or why don't
That's
you
good
agree to that?
advice. Yeah, that's good advice.
So that was really helpful for me.
Excellent tip. Dr. Tripodi, can you actually step back and tell us the process, what parents should be seeing versus, I don't want to say might or might not see, but the process for local screening and getting testing? Parents have often a lot more options than they may think they have.
Yeah, and
Sure.
that's a great question. And I think fortunately bring some perspective to this as somebody who's worked for a public school system as a school psychologist and then transitioned to private practice, these past 12 years. And there are very different processes inside of a school, and in private practice. So I'm going to talk about the school process first. I think something that can be, just to be blunt, right, for parents and for school professionals, is that schools are, they operate under special education law and the special education process when identifying children. And there's this, notion of that there has to be, educational impact, which we can debate about, what that is. So you could, in theory, talk to your child's school and come forward, and say, I have this set of concerns and I want this to be further investigated. I'd like for you to do some sort of evaluation or observation. And sometimes the school can come back and say, we're not really seeing an impact right now, so we're not going to proceed with an evaluation. But they might want to do some observations and, perhaps implement some other measures. And in a school setting, you have, some different options available to you, more informal supports, that you can, talk to the school counselor or the social worker or whomever about, the teacher. And then the formal options, which are in the form of a 504 plan, which is, a legal document that provides accommodations and supports for a student, but not special education instruction or direct instruction. And then the special education process that leads to the creation of an individualized education plan, an IEP, which does provide accommodation and support and also specialized instruction. And that latter process, requires you to go through a more formal testing process. Um, so that's a bit about how the school part of this would work. On the outside, though, you don't have to wait for all of that. And a lot of what, we see, I think in private practices, we can often take a deeper dive from a neuropsychological perspective into a child's functioning. There is no, benchmark for when we can do that type of an assessment. So oftentimes parents will come and say, this is how my child's presenting. We want to get really clear about a diagnosis, not just is there ADHD, but what type and how is it presenting and what sort of evidence-based, recommendations can exist for home and school. And that's where outside of in a private practice setting, we can take a much deeper dive into functioning.
Sarah, can you tell me your process? You said that you really had to ask. Once you had it in local screening, was it pretty straightforward, or was it still a lot of advocacy on your part?
Well, I think something that I learned as a parent in this process is that the advocacy never ends. And so even though we got to a point where there was a really strong partnership and things were moving forward, um, there was always a reason to advocate. And I think something that I found really helpful is, getting to conversations that, we kind of alluded to in the past where maybe there's an answer of, well, no, we're not going to do this. But just always asking, what's the alternative or what's another option? And so in that advocacy process, hearing no, or hearing that, but then also kind of wondering aloud to the team, well, what else or what next then? And I think sometimes when we're so rooted in that process as professionals, maybe sometimes we're not conveying to families what the options are and what that can look like. And so I really found that it was super helpful for me to just continually ask, okay, well, so what's the option then moving forward here? And so if there are things that are happening in school or goals on the IEP or things that aren't going well, just really asking very explicitly, well, what's the next step? What do you recommend? What are the options that are available to us? And so again, it's kind of like having those questions just in your back pocket or written out somewhere so that you can kind of fall back on them. Once you get to a certain point in the process where they are, where the school is taking testing, they've done the testing or they received the testing from a private center, it does get a lot easier once that is available. But really, the advocacy just doesn't end. It's ongoing, and my son's going to be going to middle school next year, so it's almost kind of starting from the beginning again with the school that
Yeah.
doesn't really know him, teachers that we don't really know. They're all wonderful, I hear, so we're all very excited, but it's kind of building those relationships again from the ground up. So that's something that we'll try to be as proactive with as possible.
One thing that I often think about and try to remind parents of is, and you talked about the advocacy never ends, and that's what made me think you don't have to sign immediately at that meeting. When you're sitting there with a decision, if you need to think about it, that's perfectly fine. A lot of parents say, well, the meeting ended, I had to sign. Once you sign,
Yeah.
there's the answer. If you disagree, you can take the paperwork with you and come back, as Sarah, as you said, with, well, what are alternatives? What else could we consider? Can you explain to me again why you chose 504 instead of IEP? Whatever the situation is, or why you don't believe at this point they qualify when we're seeing X, Y, or Z, and maybe there really actually even is impact if grades are being affected, but what's average is often the question in the public schools. So I like making sure the parents understand if we're thinking of, best ways to support our child. You don't have to, it's overwhelming. I mean, I've sat on both sides of that table. I hate sitting on the parent side. I always was like, I belong on the other side of the table. I like it much more over there. It's overwhelming for a parent, whether you know what you're doing or I can't even imagine. I mean, I knew what I was doing and it was awful. So I can't imagine not knowing what I'm doing. But the whole idea of you can take a breath and you can, think about it and ask somebody, I think is an important point.
Mhm.
And I know sometimes they'll come back to the tester. Dr. Tripodi, if somebody comes back to you and says, we haven't signed yet, but we just got this as our answer to local screening. How can you help as the tester? What else? What are other? What can anything be added, and what can
Right.
be done at that point from your perspective?
Right. Well, I think I'll answer it in two parts. I think the first is I have a strong personal ethos, as a professional that, uh, the kids will succeed. Kids do best when everyone is collaborating and working together as a team to support them. And, the best outcomes that I see are when, the outside providers recognize the strengths and limitations of the school and vice versa. I don't have the insight into a child's school day the same way their teacher does. And so, when I can establish a really strong partnership with my patients' teachers or counselors, which more times than not we're able to do, I can get a more unique perspective into how they're functioning in school, which guides, my interventions and my decisions, in test selection and things like that. So I think the first thing is we want to remind parents to build a strong partnership as to their, to the best of their ability with the schools. Um, you know, the other piece is that there are things that we can investigate, outside that are not always available to parents in school, right? So perhaps, you can go to a doctoral level psychologist who has more training in executive functioning assessment or can directly test and measure different types of attention or memory, who can bring another perspective to the school as well. And in the best case scenarios, you're presenting and sharing that data, and then the experts on the school side are saying, this is how I can integrate that into their planning, whether it's formal or informal planning.
So I guess like from um as a parent, like, if I'm not in the field, what are some questions parents can ask the evaluator? And like what is in the purview of the evaluator? Um and like
In the
because
school or outside the school?
so I think like just like for the school
Oh,
probably is really what I'm
yeah,
going for. Because I
yeah,
think, as an evaluator, I feel like our position it's not entirely understood to parents and like how much we can actually
right,
do
yeah.
from that perspective. So I'd love to hear
Yeah.
what you think.
Yeah, well, just to put the information out there first and then to give you some questions. Again, in the best case scenarios, at these meetings, somebody who will be at that meeting is the school psychologist who will explain what the assessment will entail, that it will likely entail an assessment of cognitive and academic functioning, social, emotional, behavioral functioning, perhaps some executive functioning. And they will explain, how and why they're administering the tests and the batteries that they are. I think that parents should be asking specific questions about the types of assessments that will look at their child holistically and across settings. So, for example, you might want to ask, how are you going to look for XYZ symptom in school? And what you want to hear is the answer that, we're looking at it across different settings. We're not just stopping in for 5 minutes during reading. We're going to look at reading, we're going to look at recess, we're going to perhaps look at gym or music. We want to get a more comprehensive understanding of functioning across, different settings during the school day. And asking specifically, tell me more about how you're going to test for attention. How are you going to look at my child's hyperactivity? So take the symptom, take the concern that you have and put it in question form. How are you going to evaluate for X? And you will likely get an answer that involves some direct measure, right? Vis-a-vis an actual test or assessment or questionnaire, and then also some more anecdotal or observational measures as well.
I love that answer. I mean,
Yeah,
Sarah,
very
you
good.
were mentioning that it was a unique situation with being in the pandemic. If you're seeing both ladies, if you are as the parent or you have been told as the evaluator, this is prevalent at home and the school is not seeing it, how do you make them aware of the fact that they might not be seeing, but I'm seeing the aftermath in homework. I'm seeing the tears. They're holding it together, they're masking, and then they're falling apart at home. How do we as parents really make sure that the school is aware of the fact that in the 24 hours there are two children showing up depending on where they are?
Mhm. I I think that's a really great question, and I always try to, when I'm reaching out to the school about my son, I try to frame it as observation, concern, question. And so when I reach out to the school, I was seeing tears with homework daily. And so I kind of framed it to the school as this is what I'm seeing at home. Every night when we sit down and we look at the planner and we look at the math homework, there's crying and there's resistance and there's negative self-talk. I'm concerned that this is, an indication that something might be underlying this behavior. And then adding a final question, is there something that we can do at school or at home in tandem to help relieve the situation. So that's just one example, but kind of framing it in that format of observation, concern, and question was just really helpful to make sure that I was explaining my entire perspective, so that the school was getting a really full picture of what the experience was at home, so that we could look at the school experience differently to see how we could tie it together. And so if that's what I'm seeing at home, if they're not seeing it that at school, what are they seeing? Because there has to be something, maybe not participating or raising the hand very often. Maybe, not turning in exit tickets. There's some sort of indicator in school that's going to precede what happens at home. And so giving them as much information as I can in that format to help find the connection was really helpful.
So Sarah, like you've given such good tidbits and advice that I think parents can really use. It's awesome. Like the sentence starters and the way you just phrase that question, concern, I'm sorry, observation,
Mhm.
concern, and then question. I mean, these are tools that parents can literally, they can take notes and they can write these things down and use them. Like, how did you come up with those? And then I know, Dr. Tripodi, I want to hear from you too. We want to hear from you too about that. But like, how did you come up with those strategies? That's really amazing.
Honestly, um, I don't know.
She's
I
brilliant.
think
I know.
Intuition.
Well, it's
there,
a reason you're in the field. I mean, it's
uh,
incredible. These are such
um,
good tools this is such a gift you're giving to families right now.
I was able to reflect on, it really was a gift to me that I had had this experience as an educator first, because I was really able to reflect back on what I would have needed, what I would have needed from a parent in this situation. And I really rely on different forms of organization, because I feel like I need ways to organize my thoughts to communicate effectively and clearly without emotion. That's something that I really try to do in these situations, because as mom, I feel like I can be a little quick to be like, like, I feel really anxious myself. Like, I am worried, I'm scared, I'm sad. And so, if I'm able to give myself those organizational strategies, I can really advocate better and more effectively for my son. And so, it just made it a lot easier where I could look at information from the school and say, okay, I'm going to give them my observation, my concern, and my question, and we're going to call it a day. And so that's kind of like how it began. And, just kind of noticing patterns, and families can kind of create their own templates in that way. If they notice, well, every time I reach out, the teacher asks me this, and then just kind of creating their own template that they can fall back on and use and really help them succeed in that way.
Well,
Yeah.
So, Dr. Tripodi, do you have more to add to that from kind of your
Sure.
clinical perspective?
Yeah, I mean those are such beautiful strategies and suggestions that Sarah had, and I really my first response was going to be documentation, to just document what you're seeing at home, how you're seeing it, when you're seeing it, the consistency, right, of how and when you're seeing it, and to just share that with the school. And I think also, in those meetings or in the communications with school personnel, just to remind everyone, there's only one child. There isn't, John, for example, at school, and then John, right? This is all part of the same child, and we're all there to support, this child. And I think, remembering, because it can be hard, right, in the private sector, right, when we hear the frustrations that families are having on the school side, and just to remember, that we are all, people go into these fields, right, because we love kids and we want to help and support and work with kids. And oftentimes, most of the times, what's getting in the way or causing contention are procedural things and not the care and the concern. So it really just becomes about effective, strong, consistent communication about procedural expectations. What can I expect and advocate for on the school side? And how do I get that? And what can I ask for, outside of school as well? In the best case scenarios, those two areas are working together to provide comprehensive support for your kid.
Dr. Tripodi, can we start with like thinking about how you think parents should be considering supporting a child's self-esteem and confidence, since ADHD and executive dysfunction often are comorbid with anxiety?
Yes, well, yeah, and I think, to start on a positive note, something, a trend in the field lately is moving more towards this understanding of, neurodivergent strength, like strengths-based understanding, of what ADHD is, right, and almost starting to reconceptualize it as a different way of thinking or processing or interpreting the world as opposed to a disorder. And so I think the first thing is to educate yourself. And there are so many great materials out there for, well, we'll start with kids, wonderful books that explain, what ADHD is. The American Psychological Association has a children's book publishing arm called Imagination Press. So imagination without the I. And they have books written by mental health professionals that talk about strengths-based ADHD, with tips for parents and for caregivers, and really talking to your child from an early age about, this is what your brain can do. This is a superpower. You can, engage in more divergent thinking. Your brain is very creative. You have the capacity to do X, Y, Z, and sort of pointing that out to them, and saying, all kids, a phrase that we use a lot in my practice or after testing when we're talking to kids about what does it mean to have ADHD is, everybody's working on something, right? Some kids are working, so for my little guys, right? Some kids are working really hard on learning how to read, or maybe to do math, or how to be a good friend. And your job right now is that we're working really hard on how to pay attention a little bit more, or what to do with our body when we're feeling restless. So as young, as you can get them, I think, the better the outcome. And then for our older students as well, pointing out what they are able to do creatively, making sure that you're pointing out their strengths, how they are overcoming challenge. For example, with the homework situation, not just did you get all of your assignments turned in this week, but hey, last week you turned in nothing, and this week we got 10 things done, right? And that is huge. And let's look at the content also of what you were able to put in there, and not just the fact that it got done. So just being aware of small moments, right, and growth, especially for your older kids, and pointing that out more than we're pointing out what they didn't do, I think is huge.
Do you think it's also helpful for these kids to understand that there's nothing wrong with them? This is their brain wiring, and it can feel validating maybe on some level. That
Yes.
they do have these struggles, but they can also, and I think that's where, maybe your testing can be helpful. Like these are the areas you shine, and maybe these are the areas that are harder for you.
Yes, I mean, I'm totally biased, right, as a neuropsychologist, that we love looking at the brain and how the
Hmm.
brain works, and it's so wonderful to be able to feed back to kids. This can be trickier for you, right? But also look at all these different areas that are so strong, and then being able to, weave that into a recommendation section for parents and for teachers that says, maybe working memory and executive functioning isn't where we want it to be, but this kiddo's got great verbal reasoning and great fluid reasoning, and here's how we can use those strengths to support these areas of weakness. And I think kids love that, especially when they can tell their parents, like, look how I did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That superpower thought
Yeah.
process is
hmm
fabulous.
Yeah.
Sarah, I want to end with you had mentioned your son is transitioning to middle school.
Mhm.
Transitions are interesting for anybody with executive function dysfunction and ADHD. How are you going to balance supporting him because you're a phenomenal advocate for
Mhm.
him while still encouraging his growth in independence?
Yeah, I one of the things that I try to do, and I feel like maybe I'm getting better at this as a parent, but is teaching him that it is okay to feel uncomfortable. And so the way that his ADHD presents sometimes is that he becomes really anxious about what's going to happen and when and how and what can he expect. And so for him, we'll do a lot of conversations about kind of what to expect, but also a lot of realistic talk about we're not going to be able to predict everything, and that's okay. And in those moments where you feel uncomfortable, that doesn't mean something is wrong. But here are some things that you can do to feel less uncomfortable. And so that's really what I want to be able to do for him is really normalize that discomfort is a part of life, and that everyone feels just uncomfortable sometimes, similar to like everyone's working on things and everyone's learning and doing. And so I think that's really the foundation for him. And this year, we're also incorporating or including him in his IEP meeting that's coming up as he is preparing to transition, so that he can really learn how to, like, firsthand, what does it look like? What are his rights as a learner and a student, and how can he advocate and who can he go to? And so that's, another thing that we'll be doing for him as a part of that transition. But, there'll still be, some of the gradual release of responsibility where maybe I'm emailing at first, and then he's emailing with support from me at home, and then hopefully he'll be able to then, be fairly independent as his own advocate by the time he goes to high school.
I love that. Ladies, I know we could talk for hours and hours and hours because we've just hit the tip of the iceberg, maybe even the tip. I don't know. Is there anything that you think is crucial that you should say to parents before we sign off?
Just from a parent perspective, I really can't stress enough the importance of taking time to connect with other people, friends who have been through the process, or maybe haven't been through the process, like, but just being able to connect with, kind of people in your circle, to talk through things. Kathy, earlier you mentioned like not signing and taking a pause when you get to the IEP phase, but taking the time to ask questions, reaching out to people at the school, even if it's just to say, I'm really feeling uncertain about this, but I can't explain why, and being able to talk it through with someone. I think the more confident parents feel, the better experience the students will have. And so I just think it's not something that parents have to navigate on their own by themselves alone, just because they're the parent. Include your community and family and friends, and make sure that you're taking the time to really explore, and get what you need to.
That's good advice.
And I was going to say, quite honestly, the same thing as Sarah, that the building of community is just so essential, that you are not alone, and that just because ADHD is something that is on people's radar, and we can talk about it, it's no less isolating sometimes when you receive an ADHD diagnosis for your child, because ADHD is incredibly nuanced in how it presents in every child, and it can feel very isolating. So I think having trusted folks in your community, that you can talk to, and check in with, is important. I also think taking care of your own mental well-being is absolutely essential. That parents should not underestimate or feel ashamed that over the fact that there are going to be very, very difficult moments in navigating an ADHD diagnosis. And, it is very normal to feel even things as deep as, despair, beyond frustration. And in those moments, it's really, advisable to reach out, get your own mental health support, whether it comes from, participating in a group, like the ones that Chad offers, or local community groups, or sometimes even schools, or finding your own therapist to check in with periodically.
Really good advice.
I love what both of you have said because I feel like takeaways are, be prepared as best you can, speak to as many people as you can. One thing that I always tell parents, and Christina, I believe like you really did say this, trust the community. All of us, sometimes we feel very isolated and we feel that maybe the school isn't listening and our child isn't important. Um, I've heard this many, 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 many times. They are listening. The more you can go in with real data, Sarah, your idea of how you approach real data, they want the information. They only see them 8 hours a day. We see them the rest of the time. Everybody's in this together. Everybody wants the best for the kids. And that's what we have to remember because it is isolating and it's scary and it's sad and it's all of the above, but it's going to be okay. We've watched a number of kids go from A to Z.
Oh,
And
yeah.
as adults, it's going to 99.9% of the time, it's going to be okay. And that's what parents have to remember.
And I think
Better
that
than okay.
from taking from both of your points, I'm also hearing this theme of kind of slowing down and taking your time a little bit. And I think as parents, we can feel a sense of urgency and wanting to move quickly. But from both of you, I'm hearing, as much as you can, like collect the data, go through these steps and slow it down a little if you can.
Yeah. We have time. This is a life process. It doesn't go away. It gets better because, the brain keeps maturing, so it gets better, but it doesn't go away completely. And that's okay because we adapt and we grow. And ultimately, for many people, it looks like it went away. As adults, we're functional. And as children, we have the supports there. We just have to carefully pick and choose kind of what's best. So, ladies, I really thank you. Sally and I thank you very much for joining us today. The second half of this presentation is going to be the adult diagnosis, the person that got through school and college, maybe college, but was diagnosed as an adult, and what that difference is coming at it in your adult life rather than having the supports through childhood. Another very interesting piece. Everybody, you'll see this. We hope all of it makes sense. If anybody has questions, email us at Chad and we will reach out to the people who can best answer them for you. Thank you for joining us and have a good evening.
In this webinar, we will be discussing the challenges of navigating life as an adult with ADHD. On this panel, we welcome Dr. Rick Silver, a psychiatrist and founder and director of Thrive Emerge. Rick has been working with neurodivergent patients and families for several decades in the DC, Maryland area. We also welcome Justine Rotolo, an ADHD life coach, licensed marriage and family therapist, and owner of Narrative Shift Coaching and Therapy. Justine is bringing a unique and personal experience to our panel as somebody who has been diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. I'm joined during this webinar with a fellow CHAD board member, Karen Ewert, in moderating this webinar. Thank you, Rick and Justine, for being part of the panel.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I'm going to start by asking some questions. Okay.
Good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So to start us off, can you give us an overview of what ADHD looks like in adults? And we'll start with you, Rick.
So, how much time do we have? So, I'll give the first answer I'll give is what it doesn't tend to look like in adults. It doesn't tend to look as much like the hyperactive, impulsive. Not to say that that isn't part of the pattern for a fair number of adults as well, but you see as the prefrontal cortex begins to mature and get the seat of executive functions begins to get myelinated through development, we begin to see reduction in some of those more hyperactive, impulsive types of presentations. And what we see is a lot more of the what we'd call the inattentive types of things. Now, that being said, the other thing that begins to show up more an adult is sort of the secondary fallout from ADHD, the small t trauma, if you will. So whereas the kids have not yet been exposed to a neurotypical world, which is kind of, death by paper cuts kind of thing in terms of the ADHD, as well as ASD, and I'll sort of throw ADHD into the equation here. By the time they're getting into high school and young adulthood, particularly for a lot of the folks that we see, that now ADHD, neurodivergence, has really begun to take a toll emotionally as well. And you begin to see a fair amount of anxiety, performance anxiety with regard to school and work, some helplessness, increased substance use, increased video use. There's a lot of, which is, I bring it up in part by saying, because oftentimes there's the misimpression that ADHD is the hyperactive kid in fifth grade, boy in fifth grade. And as we learned when I was coming up through my psychiatry training many years ago, ADHD goes away when you're 18. It just magically disappears, except that it doesn't. And we all know that, who've been living it or working in the field. So I think it's important at the outset for people to be aware of, which most people are who have ADHD, of the complexity of the condition and how it is life altering. And it's not just about some problems with paying attention or being a little bit too impulsive. So let me stop there because I could go on forever, but yeah.
So Justine, can you talk a little bit about what you see, kind of comparing, contrasting an adult experience versus what we know of a childhood experience, in terms of presentation and kind of how it impacts you?
Yes, and I agree with Rick that I know for myself as I got older, because I was definitely hyperactive, impulsive, it became quieter in that arena, but louder in other places. Like, because I wasn't diagnosed till I was 40, depression and anxiety took over. And one of the things that I notice in a lot of the adults that come in, they don't present as hyperactive, impulsive, but they do have depression. And a lot of the depression is from the feelings of being overwhelmed as an adult with all the things they have to do, especially you layer on top of working, being a parent, as I had to do as well. And then the anxiety of, waking up in the morning and not really knowing which foot to put down first. And so I see that, whereas kids come in, I just had a new client today and they're bouncing all over the place and coming in and playing with everything in the office, which is what it's here for. And they're just a bundle of energy and creativity. And I also think in adults, that creative side sometimes has been pushed down. And I like to help them bring that back out, because some kind of fear there. And I think the depression and anxiety will push that to the side. And so helping them bring that back out can help them really appreciate, I guess, in some ways, the power of the neurodivergent brain. But there definitely is a difference between the two.
Thank you. Rick, when you're working with adults who have ADHD, are most of them coming to you and haven't been diagnosed, or do you have a lot of people that it's the next phase and they're seeing that transition, and so they're probably looking for something different than maybe what they needed when they were younger?
Both, but I will say there's a fair number of people who are showing up, sort of de novo, in their 30s and 40s and 50s. This was a younger woman who came into my office at the time, as many years ago. She's about 25 at the time. And it was before I really was very conversant with ADHD and its symptoms, because, of course, I didn't need to learn it as an adult psychiatrist. Go figure. And, she had odd set of symptoms that I didn't really understand. She was little depressed and a little anxious and some other problems with functioning that I didn't quite get. And I sent her off for neuropsych testing, and she came back. And in the middle of my waiting room, she stood up and said, Dr. Silver, guess what? I have ADHD. And to have that, not that she needed a diagnosis, but to have a framework where suddenly my life makes sense. Now my experiences make sense to me. So this happens, we see it with ADHD, we see it with autism as well. But it's so liberating in some ways for many of these people who are coming in when they're older. There's a smaller percentage who really grapple with it because for them, it feels like they're somehow broken. They don't like it. And it's understandable, because that particular brain interacting with the world has created a set of problems for them over time. And I think there are some people who just wish it would go away. And it takes a little bit of time to adjust to the fact that this is indeed how you're going to be in the world. And it's really a wonderful brain. It's a great place to be with all of its challenges. It has also, some amazing things that it brings to the table too. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
Justine, when you first were given the diagnosis, can you talk about your reaction and how that impacted you going forward?
Yeah, I was actually 40 when I was diagnosed, and the way that I got diagnosed was my older child at the time was 9, and he was diagnosed with ADHD, depression, anxiety, and I thought, I mean, this is me. So I went to a psychiatrist, and I was also diagnosed, and just like Rick was saying, it just gave me answers to my life because I struggled in elementary school and high school and college. I almost failed out. My last year in college, I had to get straight A's, and I feel so bad, but my parents were both immigrants from Italy. And when my grades came home, I told them F meant fine and WD meant well done because I was so overwhelmed. I didn't know what I didn't know what to do. It wasn't great when they figured out what was really happening, though. But my last year in college, I ended up working with my brother-in-law, who was amazing, and I got straight A's. That's what I had to get in order to get out. But it just gave me an answer. And again, why I was on my second marriage at age 40. Just all the drama that I was experiencing in my life and the dysregulation and having trouble with communication. So it was exciting for me in the moment to look back and recognize that I had this neurobiological disorder that was causing all these issues for me. It gave me answers.
Mm-hmm.
If I might, Justine, I think that well done and fine is such a brilliant example of the creativity of the ADHD brain. So just thinking outside of the box, just like
absolutely that. Fast. You had to.
Fast.
I've heard from a lot of adults that will say, oh yeah, I'm sure I have ADHD too. But I think a lot of adults feel like I should be able to manage it, or yeah, I'm pretty sure I have it. So why should I go to somebody? And I feel like each of you have touched on that, but I'm wondering, like, concretely, if somebody were to come seeking a diagnosis or feeling that they have it, what kind of benefits would they receive from seeking treatment?
First of all, whether it's ADHD or it's any other psychiatric condition, I think there's two criteria that you're really looking at about why should I get treatment, which is always a reasonable question. Symptoms don't have to translate into treatment. It's a very personal choice. But the two things are distress and dysfunction. Is it bothering me that I feel this way? Am I depressed? Am I too anxious? Do I not like that I can't focus? So there's the distress or the quality of life from that standpoint. And then there's the dysfunction. Is it getting in the way? I'm not performing at work. I'm getting D's. I'm getting F's and WD's at school, right? I can't do it. So, that if somebody says, I'll often ask people about both those things. And if somebody says, yes, both of those are troublesome to me, I'll say, fine. If you come for treatment, and then we ask, what is ADHD treatment? Well, it's often sort of oversimplifying the three-legged stool. It's, the coaching, accommodations, med management, although there are many other things that we can talk about with regard to ADHD treatment. But I say, say if you try some or all of these things, chances are that your functioning will improve and your quality of life will improve. That's why you get treatment. But it's a very personal choice. Oftentimes people say, well, I don't want to do that. It feels too stigmatizing. I'll say, hey, you can choose to live with whatever symptoms you want to in your life. But there are possibilities of getting better.
Yes.
That's not fixing you. I want to be
Right.
clear. We're not fixing anybody here.
Nope.
Right. We're improving functioning. So
Yes. Absolutely.
Justin, you were touching on some strategies, and I know you wear two hats, so that both having ADHD yourself and also working with individuals with ADHD. You were touching on before some strategies of what you felt like are helpful for an individual with ADHD. Could you maybe expand on that?
Sure. Yeah. So if I can go back for a minute, 19 years ago was when I was kind of falling apart. I was living in California in graduate school. I'm not going to go into what was going on, but I had some trauma, and I just decided I was going to get better. I had been to therapy, I had been all over the place, and I just wanted to work on myself. So I found meditation. It is the only thing I've ever followed through on in my life. And I didn't want to do it. And a very good friend of mine in graduate school said, what about 3 minutes a day? Can you just start there? And 30 days makes a habit. And I was like, oh my God, I'm from New York. This is ridiculous. I've never meditated in my life, but I did it. And I recognized when I started doing it that my brain was craving it because my brain was so all over the place.
yes.
I was getting up in the morning and it was all like the what ifs and what if this happens and what am I going to do if that happens? And I really quieted my brain. And the bigger part was being able to live in the moment. And
Yes.
this is something that I share with my adult clients that come in. I ask them if they're interested in doing the work, and then they can be where I'm at because I am so much better because of that work. I'm not saying I'm 100%, nobody is, but I just feel so much better. And when they do the work with me, because like Rick said, we don't fix them, we give them tools. And if they're
Yes.
willing to do the work with the tools that we give them, they're going to get better as well. And the other thing that I do with everybody that comes in is the executive function deficits. We work through them, we set goals for them, we come up with different things that they can do, to set timers for time awareness and, organization. There's all different kinds of things, but that's really where I start is with the mindfulness and the meditation, which anybody can go online and look it up. It can definitely make a difference with our brain.
Can I, Karen, can I hop in here and piggyback on some of what Justine is saying? Because I think there's several things that deserve some highlighting here in no particular order. One is ADHD, in fact, all neurodivergence are genetically driven conditions first and foremost. Okay, it has nothing to do with willpower. And that's not to say people don't, sometimes say, I don't want to do stuff. Fine. The infant who is born with a neurodivergent brain isn't lazy. They're just born with a neurodivergent brain. And I'll say to people oftentimes, when do you think ADHD begins? And let's say, well, my kids started showing symptoms when they're like 6 years old. And I said, that's when it started manifesting. When did it start? And they'll kind of look at me quizzically. And I'll say, it started when Mr. Sperm met Mrs. Egg. Because 3 weeks later, the brain was beginning to form. And that was a neurodivergent brain. So don't say things to your kids like, just do it. Don't do the Nike parenting. This is about, I can't do it, not I won't do it. So it's first and foremost a biological condition. And why is meditation and why is exercise so crucial? Because the key challenge with a neurodivergent brain biologically is significant dysregulation of energy, emotions, focus, sensory experiences, right? Amount of data that appears in the brain, and anything that you can do that gives you better access to your prefrontal cortex, which includes good sleep, good exercise, meditation.
Yep.
It's very powerful. And specifically, what happens with the meditation is you're switching out of fight or flight response. If we look at it from a polyvagal perspective, you're switching out of fight or flight response into a ventral vagal state, relaxation response, right? You can't, and if you're dysregulated, it's uncomfortable, and you live a lot in a fight or flight state, it's really hard to be focused in fight or flight. So what do? You meditate for 3 minutes, or maybe your meditation is running, right? Either way, you're bringing the brain from fight or flight to ventral vagal. You're calming it down. You're allowing the prefrontal cortex to do what it does best, which is regulate the executive functions. So these things work. So, okay, my oldest daughter runs for her meditation.
Okay.
Right? She couldn't sit still
Great.
literally for 30 seconds. She's never going to be a Buddhist. Go figure. So, right? But she runs and it does the same thing for her.
Yes. Yeah. Or you can color. I mean, that's another thing. Or you can knit. I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many things that you can do. And I share that with my clients because I don't want them to think I want them to sit like this. You know, that's not what I want them to do. But I want them to experience, like you're saying, the benefits of it.
Yes.
It's amazing.
And the other piece, and I'm guessing that you've experienced this too with the meditation, is the key piece of meditation is awareness, right?
Yes.
Well, what is it that's missing for a lot of people who are neurodivergent is that interoception. So to sit just for a minute, right, and pay attention to like, oh, this is what's going on in my body that's a very powerful experience and a very regulating experience, because then you begin to find a home inside of yourself.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was going to ask because, I mean, what you're describing, it cuts across a lot of different conditions, because it about regulation and about, whenever you're dysregulated, the strategies that you can do to become regulated again. So it doesn't seem, some of what you're talking about isn't unique to ADHD, but in any condition when you're feeling dysregulated, the things that you can do to help ground yourself, calm yourself. I know that at least I primarily work with children, and when I work with children with ADHD, there's a lot of resistance to having to be still.
Yes.
And so a lot of the modifications that we do have to do with, can we do mindful movement? Can we modify them? And so I'm wondering for adults as well, are there modifications to do so that it doesn't feel so initially aversive if they're trying to do meditation, or if they're trying to do something to be still? Because sometimes it can just feel uncomfortable.
Yes, no, because I've had a lot of people tell me, it's interesting. I didn't have this, but a lot of people tell me when they hear their heart, it scares them. So they sitting still and focusing on their breath is not what they like to do. So like I just talked about coloring, there's a lot of meditation coloring books out there. And walking meditation, of course, you leave your eyes open, you don't close them. But walking meditation is really can be very powerful. Looking outside and looking at the beautiful trees, not right now because it's a little too cold, but any kind of walking, and they're knitting, as I said before, people that use things to do with their hands. As you're focusing on what you're doing with your hands, then the thoughts are going to come up. But if you refocus on what you're doing with your hands, the thoughts kind of drift, they come back. It's all about not engaging in those thoughts. It's not following those thoughts. It's being present. And that's what meditation, all forms of meditation, can help with, so that you don't have to sit still.
If you're training in many of the wisdom traditions, Justine, this is that they'll say that everything is meditation, because meditation is just about bringing awareness to whatever exists in that moment. Yes. So meditation is not sitting on a cushion in lotus position. Meditation is bringing awareness to anything at all. And all the wisdom traditions have walking meditations as part of them too.
Yes.
And those are equally powerful experiences if you allow yourself to come out of the busy mind.
That's it. Yeah.
Right? And be present with your experience.
Yeah. And just the whole idea of noticing thought. That's something that can be very difficult. It took me a long time before I was really able to just notice. I can still remember the day when I did for the first time. And in noticing it, I realized, oh my God, I'm engaging in this. This is why I can't be with myself in the car, because these thoughts are just constant, constant, constant. But once, and this is what I like to help clients with, noticing those thoughts. Once they notice them, then they're able to say, well, that's a fascinating thought. I'm not following that thought.
Yes.
I'm going to stay in the present, just
Mhm.
in the what is, not the what was, not the what ifs, in the what is.
You know, there's a particular kind of thought patterns that we often see with people with ADHD, which I call freight train brain, right? So it's not rumination. It's not like, oh, I'm stuck on an idea and it worries me. It's just that, you know, this one, right? Constant. The river is raging. Constant. So, but sometimes simply labeling that for people
Yes.
as a real phenomenon, it's like, oh, that's and it's real. It might be distressing, but it's really okay to have a brain that does that. Well, yeah, you want to work with it maybe, but there's nothing wrong with you that you do that.
You know, I never knew until I picked up the book, The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, because the first chapter in the book is the voice inside your head. I never knew other people had my brain until I saw that chapter. And
Yeah.
then I just cried because I thought, oh my God, I'm not crazy. Other people
Yeah.
are dealing with chatter all day. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. What a
Normalizing
powerful.
it can be really powerful, and realizing you're not the
Yes.
only person who experiences that, then it gives you a whole community of people that perhaps you can connect to and learn
Yes.
together.
Yes. Absolutely.
But think of that. What you just said, Justine. I mean, that's such an important thing. I mean, you know, I walk around. I don't think I'm crazy. I got my quirks and stuff like that. But if you have never had your ADHD diagnosed or your ASD, and you're struggling with getting along with the world, if you get to a point where you can be shown what's really going on, and you can say, "I'm not crazy," what an incredibly life-altering perception that is. So, I
It
mean, that's
is.
right. So, even before you get to treatment, sort of the whole psychoeducation component of this is so powerful in terms of changing their people's
So true.
perceptions. Yeah.
So
Mhm.
true.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what the role plays with spouses, and the dynamic between spouses, and understanding um, each other's brains, and working complementary together. I'm throwing it out to anybody if you want to talk a little bit about
So
what
if you
that's
don't
like.
mind, Rick, I'll just
Oh, for
jump
it.
in for
Yeah.
a minute.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my present husband, third time's a charm, he and I both have ADHD. So we have a lot of fun, but we also had to talk to each other about how we were really going to communicate effectively. He also is on the spectrum. So we're really good together because we work hard on understanding each other. But I will say, I do work with couples, and the thing that makes me very sad is when one comes in with ADHD and the other one, and I'll always do the psychoeducation and offer the book Driven to Distraction or other books that would help the the um the husband or the wife that doesn't have ADHD to understand more, because I see a lot of judgment, a lot of criticism, a lot of shame. And I try to help the other couple, the member of the couple, the one who does not have it, to understand the shame that the person that has it is living with. And the more they kind of beat them over the head with, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, it's very difficult. So,
Yeah. Yeah. There's a fellow that I was talking to who the other day, one of my patients who's like your husband, he had both recently diagnosed. He's in his 50s, ASD and you know, spectrum disorder and ADHD. And he was talking about his relationship with his wife. And he says she happens to be somebody who is patient, thoughtful, but
nice.
she's human, right? At the
Yes.
same
Yes.
time. So she read, you know, sometimes she's a pain in the rear
Yes.
end and he knows it.
Yes.
But he
Yes.
says the things that come up are like she's talking and I interrupt, right? So impulsive. Two, I've no interoception. So she tells me a story that's like a heartbreaking story. And I shouldn't use the word interception. It's not quite right. It's more about the emotional
Empathy,
expression.
maybe empathy. Yeah.
Well, but he says, I'm very sensitive and very empathic. I just can't find the words for it.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So the wife is like, do you care about me? I'm telling you some heart-wrenching story, and you're sitting there
Wow.
like a log. Like, do you care about me?
Wow.
So there's many ways, but I think it really gets down to what you're talking about in any relationship, whatever the challenges are. And I said this to my daughters. I said, look, loving someone is like, yes, it's good some of the time, but the joy only comes out of huge amounts of challenging work that you're going to do.
Absolutely.
That's it, right? And in
Yeah.
a way, it doesn't matter what the work is. Are you committed to knowing this person as they are, learning to be accepting, compassionate, patient?
Yes, absolutely.
So I've been with my wife 48 years, and I haven't learned to
Wow.
be any of those things yet. So I'm working on it. Maybe we should come to you.
Well, we
Come
talk
on in.
about with
Come on
we
in.
talk about with kids, and I think with adults and relationships, it's accepting your partner as they are right
Yes.
now,
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
and that can be
Yes.
a lot.
Yes.
But I wonder, a silver lining, can we kind of talk about a little bit strengths?
Hmm.
So if individuals with ADHD, what are your superpowers? What could people maybe find themselves really excelling in?
I mean, for me, my superpower is communication. I I have always been, even prior to being diagnosed. I mean, it got a lot better after I was diagnosed, but I was able to regulate. And now that I'm regulated, I'm more in control of the other executive function deficits, as Rick mentioned before. But what I learned about communication is you have a tidal wave of emotion that comes over the neurodivergent brain. If you ever got stuck in a wave, I think you know it's difficult to get out. Imagine a tidal wave of emotion, and we can't even name some of the emotions that are coming up. So, what I've learned how to do, one of my superpowers, is to wait to that tidal wave turns into a tide pool before I start to
Hmm.
then communicate with the
Mhm.
person. I'm talking about people that I love in my life, my kids, my husband, my siblings, but I'll wait and then I will start to communicate. And I'm I'm good at that because of all the work I've done prior to this point in my life. So it is one of my superpowers. But the other superpower is our creative mind. I mean, we were talking before about F means fine, WD. I have a very creative mind. I may not be someone who draws, but years ago I danced and I played piano, and I just love communication. And I think that's part of my creative mind is how well I'm able to communicate and read people. Yeah, we're very intuitive, I believe, people with ADHD. That's another superpower is the intuitiveness.
I would ditto those. I think those are good. And if you look, I mean, you, me, Karen, right? Why have we started the centers or businesses that we've started? Because there's a vision, there's a passion, there's a
The
living in the
passion.
moment, there's a
Yes.
flexibility, right? And
Yes.
creativity
Yes.
that allows us to generate these things that are completely we love out of the box stuff,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's it. That's what made, the school, your school. Why is your school brilliant? Not because it's in the box, right?
That's
Because it
right.
stepped out of the box so it could understand what's really going on with neurodivergent brains.
Yes.
That's what makes Sycamore so effective.
Yes.
But to me, I mean, who knows where it really comes from? Maybe we have little Martians in our heads. I don't know. But I think that is part of the neurodivergent wiring that makes that possible. Yeah.
Yes. I
I would
agree.
concur with that too, being that uh, I found that a lot of entrepreneurial people have that spark. You look at all the well-known entrepreneurs in our, throughout the history of mankind, and you know that they've had that neurodiverse brain, ADHD, and they've
Yes.
had these great visions and made them a reality, which is great. And
Yeah.
that, you know, when you let an ADHD adult be more creative in a, say, a workplace environment, you can get a lot of wonderful feedback and creative ideas to spark, you know, community of workers in a business setting as well. That being said, I don't know if either of you have experienced or have any input about people who, because we talked about the private, personal interactions, about the adult that's perhaps concerned about their longevity at work because of
Yes.
their needs to maybe get up and walk around, or needing
Yes.
to be in a certain space that makes them more productive. What have you experienced with the people you work with, or maybe with yourselves, that you can share?
Well, I can talk a minute about myself. Years ago, I was in the retail business. So when I was living in DC 40 plus years ago, I worked for a company called Hex. I don't know if anybody remember Hex.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, I was the first electronics woman buyer in the United States. I bought, and I had to walk behind the Japanese men because at that point that was a no-no. I hated it. Why did I hate it? Because I had to punch a clock. And the clock was really about FaceTime. So I had to be in at 7 a.m. And then I'd have to stay till 7 o'clock. And at this point in time, I was looking to get married and start a family. And I didn't enjoy the paperwork. I didn't know I had ADHD at this point. I couldn't stand the follow through, the constant going into your boss and telling them how wonderful they were. And I, a couple of times, almost lost my job. Number one, for being late. And number two, one day I ran out of there hysterical. It was the dysregulation. So years later, I started to coach. And this is my passion. I mean, people ask me, because I'm here sometimes 7 days a week, and people will say to me, how do you do this? I love what I do. And so what I've noticed over the years, the people that I've worked with and have get different jobs, and very similar to what I was in, miserable, unhappy with punching clocks, not someone who in the morning wants to get up and go to work. They'd rather exercise and then go in. And when I was in California, one of the big companies out there was excellent in terms of giving neurodivergent people, wasn't called that back then, it was more ADHD than anything else. They give them the spaces that they needed. If they needed to be in an office with a shut door because of noise, they do that for them. They actually had me come in and do some seminars for the people, and they would also pay me for seeing their people. So it was wonderful. It was Boeing. They were wonderful about that. I think there's a lot of people who could do so much better at work if they felt more comfortable with being neurodivergent. They go to work and they feel like this. They can't say anything to anybody about what's going on, although they can, but they don't feel like they can, nor do they want to. So they live with the judgment and the criticism and the shame. And I wish there were more companies out there that were more ADA friendly and would help these people with what they need. And I've had a lot of people leave the punching the clock to becoming entrepreneurs. And I encourage that, because that's a passion that you have found. You're gonna excel at what you're doing, and you're gonna feel so good about what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I hope that answered your question, but that's what I've noticed with people. Yeah.
That's
Adult.
really interesting about the masking, because you hear a lot of masking when it comes to autism, but I don't feel like you hear that term as much with ADHD, but it makes sense of you're trying to fit in a box of whatever role you think is expected of you.
Of a neurotypical.
That's hard.
It's very hard.
Yeah.
And they're embarrassed and they feel like they're being shamed. I've had a number of people recently telling me about their bosses, just giving them a hard time. They have a different, like you said, wouldn't it be great if we could just take that brain and utilize it for the betterment of this company rather than shaming the brain.
Yeah.
And it has to begin with, I think the good manager is curious about anybody in front of them. How are you going to get the most out of your people? If you're not curious about how they interact with their environment and what their internal world is like. So, you have to be a little bit of a psychologist or a therapist if you're going to be a good manager, right? You have to think, how does this person experience the world? Are they more rigid? Are they concrete? Do they see things on a 30,000-foot level? Do they tend to get a little emotional in their decision making? They want to sit quietly at meetings. Do they run out of energy after 3 hours and need a break? Whatever it might be, all the myriad presentations of a neurodivergent brain in the workplace. But yes, we can have policies, all very important, and not minimizing that at all. But ultimately, it's like a teacher, day to day, the value of that person in the workplace will be made more manifest if the manager is simply curious about it.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Very good point.
The relationship.
Excellent.
That's
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Well, is there anything that we should have asked? So are there any questions or any information you were hoping to share and we haven't asked the right question? And if so, what is there anything additional that you wanted to make sure others know about related to adult ADHD?
Well, if I can say something that really affected me when I was growing up, I was called lazy, stupid, and a procrastinator when I was growing up. And, I hung on to that negative story most of my life. And one of the things I wanted to say, there's a myth about ADHD, and that myth is that people are lazy, that people just they're not motivated to do whatever. That's so untrue because we are not lazy. We get overwhelmed, and at times we'll shut down if we're feeling overwhelmed. I certainly that can happen to me. And that's when people, depending on who you're with, can say, well, I asked you to vacuum and you didn't do that, or I asked you to contact the accountant and you didn't do that. And they're not realizing that this isn't about us being lazy. It's about, in the moment, we're feeling very overwhelmed. And Rick, I don't know if you notice this, but I notice when my clients are overwhelmed, their depression can grow too at the same time. So that's a myth that I'm disturbed about because I don't like that word. And when people come in with their kids, I tell them to leave that word at the door because it's just so bad. It creates shame for everybody, whether you're a child, adolescent, or adult.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would add that probably the best thing that you can do, whether you have ADHD or autism, however you might be unique and wonderful, the best thing that you can do is find the people in your personal world, your professional world, in your your therapeutic world. Find the people who believe in you. Because you've spent 20 plus years by the time you get to young adulthood being told that you're not enough and you're broken and you're disappointing, and you start to believe it. Recovering from the small t trauma of neurodivergence is in part because you find a community of people who just get you and love you and believe in you no matter what. And that is the most healing thing. And without that, all the techniques don't matter.
I agree with you 100%. Yeah. I run an adult support group every other week online, and it's actually for Chad in California because I was on the board. Chad, and I'm going to put that link on my website if anybody wants to hop on. It's all free, and it's an hour and a half every other Saturday. And I look forward to that because I love to gather people together that have all these wonderful ideas and they're so creative. And we talk about all different things. And I learn every time I get on there. I'm just the facilitator, but I love to see what people do in the adult groups. They're wonderful.
Yeah. If we're doing shameless self-promotion, which I love, Justine, I think it's great. might I add that Well, we're entrepreneurs, right? It's in our
Yeah.
blood.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But speaking of groups, we do once a month at the third Thursday of the month, we do a parent support group specifically
Oh,
for
nice.
parents of teens and young adults who are struggling with that neurodivergent transition to young.
Very nice. Is it online or is it in person?
It's Zoom. Yeah, it's
Okay.
on.
And there are a lot of resources. And so, and that's part of also Chad is having
Yes.
a
Yes.
place to have those resources. So I would say if anybody's looking for a support group or looking to connect, to get a diagnosis, you can always reach out to our
That's great.
chapter,
Yes.
and we can offer those resources to you.
Yes.
Thank you both so much for sharing
Thank you.
your
Thank you.
expertise, because
Yeah.
This was
I mean,
so nice.
I thought it was invaluable, and just it's interesting to me how much it differs with adults than it does with children. So I learned a lot. Thank you.
It does. And I enjoyed meeting all of you.
Pam and Karen also saw you.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.